In a world of wolves, she was nothing. A wolfless servant hiding a secret that could get her killed. She is the last of the Argent kindred, a bloodline of moonlight and magic, massacred by a rival clan. For years, she has survived by being invisible within the stone walls of the Grey Bastion. But when the formidable Lycan king announces a lethal tournament to choose his queen, a single impulsive act of mercy exposes her. He feels her forbidden power, sees the mythic wolf she hides within, and gives her an ultimatum: fight for his crown or be thrown to the very enemies who slaughtered her family. He sees a weapon, she sees a cage. Chapter 1. The Girl Who Wasn't There. The cold was a living thing in the scullery of the Grey Bastion. It seeped through the thick stone walls, sank into the flagstone floor, and wrapped its icy fingers around Oriana's bones. It was a constant, familiar ache, second only to the one in her lower back from hunching over the great copper cauldrons day after day. Steam rose in thick, greasy clouds, smelling of boiled vegetables and old meat, but it offered no warmth. Nothing in the underbelly of the fortress ever did. Her hands, chapped and red, plunged back into the harsh, lye-heavy water. She scrubbed at a scorched pot with a bristled brush, her movements methodical and numb. Small. Quiet. Unseen. This was the mantra that kept her alive. Here, she was not the last ember of a dying star. She was just Anna, the scullery maid with downcast eyes and a silent tongue. A wolfless omega. Less than nothing. Beneath her skin, under the layers of grime and exhaustion, the power hummed. It was always there, a low silver thrum of energy coiled tight in her chest. A river of starlight dammed behind her ribs. Most days, it was a quiet companion, a secret warmth in the endless cold. But on nights when the moon was full and bright, it became a wild, caged thing, clawing at the bars of her control, begging for release. On those nights, she would press her forehead against the freezing stone of her tiny cell, her knuckles white as she fought the urge to shift, to unfurl into the creature of myth her blood demanded her to be. The heavy thud of boots on the stone floor made her flinch. 2 alphas from the king's guard strode down the corridor, their leather armor creaking, their powerful strides eating up the space. They were laughing, their voices booming in the narrow passage, their scent, all musk and dominance, assaulting her senses. Oriana pressed herself flat against the damp wall, making her world smaller, tucking her chin to her chest. As they passed, their shoulders nearly brushed hers, but their eyes slid over her as if she were a smudge of soot on the stone. They saw a servant, a fixture, a ghost. They did not see the tremor in her hands or the silver light that flickered behind her tightly closed eyelids. She was alone. Utterly. Surrounded by hundreds of Lycans, from the highest noble to the lowest servant, yet she was a species of one. The last. The memory, sharp and unwanted, pierced through her defenses. The scent of burning pine, the glint of moonlight on silver fur turned crimson, a scream that had no sound. She squeezed her eyes shut, pushing it back down into the dark where it belonged. The last pot was clean. She dried her hands on her rough-spun apron and turned to leave the oppressive heat of the scullery. Her footsteps were soundless echoes in the cavernous halls, a whisper of movement in a fortress of roaring fires and clanging steel. Her only destination was the cold, cot-sized room she called her own, a brief respite before the dawn brought the same endless routine. But as she reached the bottom of the servants' staircase, a sound cut through the air, deep and resonant. It was not the familiar clang of the dinner bell or the changing of the guard. It was a horn, a single powerful blast that vibrated through the very stones of the fortress, a summons that promised everything was about to change. Chapter 2. A Crown of Blood. The summons horn echoed into silence, but a new tension took its place. The very air in the Grey Bastion grew heavy, charged with anticipation. Word spread from the highest battlements to the deepest cellars. The king was to make a proclamation. Oriana, caught in the tide of movement, was herded with the other servants to the periphery of the great hall. She found a place behind a thick tapestry depicting an ancient hunt, the wool scratching against her cheek, leaving just a sliver of the hall visible. The great hall was a breathtaking cavern of power. Flames roared in a hearth large enough to roast a whole ox, casting dancing shadows across the snarling wolf heads carved into the rafters. Every powerful alpha in the kingdom was present, their fine cloaks and polished leather a stark contrast to Oriana's threadbare tunic. They stood in anxious whispering clusters, their collective energy a low growl that vibrated in Oriana's teeth. Then he entered. The whispers died instantly, smothered by a wave of pure, uncompromising authority. King Theron moved not like a man, but like a storm-given form. He was immense, broad-shouldered, and clad in black armor that seemed to drink the firelight. His dark hair was pulled back from a face carved from granite, his features harsh and battle-worn. But it was his eyes that held the true power, the cold, piercing gold of a predator. He ascended the dais and took his seat on the iron throne, the silence in the hall so absolute Oriana could hear the crackle of the fire. "Too long has this kingdom been fractured," his voice boomed, deep and resonant, a sound that bypassed the ears and settled directly in the bones. Rivalries fester, old wounds bleed anew, packs that should be united in strength squabble over territory and pride like pups. He let his gaze sweep across the assembled nobles, and Oriana saw more than one powerful alpha flinch. "I will have unity. I will have strength. I will have a queen." A collective gasp went through the hall. "But not one chosen for political convenience or a fertile bloodline," Theron continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "The queen of the Grey Bastion must be a warrior. She must be a survivor. She must be worthy." He leaned forward, his golden eyes blazing. "I hereby reinstate the ancient right. I announce the beginning of the Blood Crown trials." Panic and excitement warred in the murmurs that erupted. The Blood Crown trials were a legend, a brutal, lethal pageant from a more savage time. "Any unwed, high-born Lycan female may enter," the king declared, his voice cutting through the noise. "They will be tested in the hunt, in endurance, and in combat. The victor will be my queen." A cold, merciless smile touched his lips. "The crown is not given, it is won, and it will be paid for in blood." From behind the tapestry, a chill colder than any scullery stone crept down Oriana's spine. The king's words were not a proclamation. They were the sharpening of 1,000 blades. Chapter 3. The Duchess in Shadow. In the chaotic aftermath of the king's announcement, the great hall became a maelstrom of ambition and fear. Oriana, tasked with offering watered wine to the agitated nobles, moved through the throng like a wraith, her head bowed and her presence ignored. It was in this sea of sharks that she first truly saw Duchess Genevieve. The Duchess was the calm at the center of the storm, a vision of deadly grace. Her gown was the color of dried blood, her raven hair coiled in an intricate, regal style. She was undeniably beautiful, but it was a cold, sharp-edged beauty, like that of a perfectly crafted dagger. She held court in a small circle of sycophants, her laughter like the tinkling of ice. Oriana watched as a younger noblewoman, Lady Alara, approached her, her face pale but determined. "Duchess," Alara began, her voice trembling slightly, I too intend to compete. For the honor of my house." Genevieve's smile didn't falter, but it turned venomous at the edges. She reached out and gently brushed a stray hair from Alara's cheek, a gesture that looked like a caress, but held the threat of a striking snake. "How brave of you, little bird," she purred, her voice a silken whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "But the trials are no place for fledgling honors. They are for eagles." Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, flickered down to the modest silver pin that held Alara's cloak. Your family's lands in the northern valleys. They are so remote, so unprotected. It would be a tragedy if, in your absence, a fire were to break out. Or a border skirmish. Things can be lost so easily. The color drained completely from Alara's face. The threat was unmistakable, a poisoned dart delivered with a smile. Genevieve retracted her hand and turned back to her admirers, dismissing the terrified girl as if she were a gnat. Oriana, standing frozen just a few feet away, felt a sickening lurch in her stomach. She had seen predators in the wild, but none were as cold or as calculating as the woman before her. Genevieve didn't just want to win, she wanted to eliminate, to crush, to salt the earth where her rivals stood. She saw the path to the throne as a slaughterhouse, and she held the butcher's knife. Oriana lowered her gaze, her own power humming in her chest with a low, protective growl she quickly suppressed. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that any woman who stood between the Duchess and the crown was already considered dead. Chapter 4. The Unseen Hand. The preliminary trials began 2 days later in the main courtyard. The space had been cleared to form a crude arena, the cobblestones already stained with the coppery scent of fresh blood. Oriana was working on an upper gallery, tasked with scrubbing the stone floors, a position that gave her a clear, detached view of the brutality below. The bouts were swift and merciless. Most competitors sought only to subdue, to force a surrender. But not Duchess Genevieve. She moved with a lethal elegance, her practice sword a blur of silver. Her opponent was a young woman from a minor house, barely 18, her face a mask of pure terror. Genevieve toyed with her, her movements fluid and contemptuous, landing shallow cuts that were more insulting than injurious. The crowd roared, hungry for the spectacle. Theron watched from his throne on a raised platform, his expression unreadable stone. The fight ended as everyone knew it would. Genevieve disarmed the girl with a flick of her wrist, sending her sword clattering across the stones. A swift kick sent the girl sprawling onto her back. She lay there, gasping and sobbing, utterly defeated. The bout was over. But Genevieve wasn't finished. She stalked toward the fallen girl, the tip of her sword leaving a thin scratch in the cobblestones. The crowd's cheers quieted, replaced by a hungry, expectant silence. A killing blow was not required, but it was permitted. It was a statement. Oriana watched, her knuckles white on the handle of her scrubbing brush. She saw the girl's wide, terrified eyes, the desperate plea for a life she was about to lose. The memory of burning pine and silent screams flashed through Oriana's mind. No, not again. It wasn't a thought, it was an instinct. A primal protective surge that bypassed all her years of careful suppression. Oriana didn't move. She barely breathed. But from the coiled knot of power in her chest, she released a single invisible thread of energy. It was no more than a whisper, a focused sigh of starlight aimed across the courtyard. Down below, Genevieve raised her sword for the final, fatal plunge. But just as her muscles tensed, her arm spasmed, a flicker so minute it was imperceptible. The blade's trajectory shifted by less than an inch. Instead of piercing the girl's throat, the steel point slammed into the stone right beside her head with a deafening crack, sending chips of granite flying. A gasp went through the crowd. The girl scrambled away, saved by what everyone assumed was a predator's whim or a moment of arrogant miscalculation. Genevieve stared at her sword, then at her own hand, a flicker of pure fury and confusion on her face. Up on the gallery, Oriana's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. She had done it. She had saved a life. And she had just broken the one rule that had always kept her safe. Chapter 5. A ripple in the calm king. Theron was bored. He sat upon his throne, a grim sentinel overseeing a predictable blood sport. He had seen this 100 times on 100 battlefields. The strong preyed on the weak. Genevieve's cruelty was efficient but uninspired. She was a weapon, yes, but she had no artistry, no soul. He was looking for a queen to unite a kingdom, not a finely honed assassin to sit beside him. His golden eyes were half closed, his mind already drifting to matters of state, to the reports of unrest on his western border. And then he felt it. It was not a sound, not a sight, not a smell. It was a ripple. A silent, crystalline note that cut through the thick, bloody tapestry of the arena. It was a wave of power, so faint it was barely a tremor, yet so pure it was utterly unmistakable. It was clean, untainted by rage or ambition. It felt like moonlight given form. And it was impossible. Magic of this nature had been wiped from the world decades ago, bled out in a massacre that was now the stuff of dark legend. Theron's boredom evaporated in an instant. His lethargy was replaced by the honed electric focus of a predator catching a scent it had only dreamed of. His eyes snapped open, wide and alert. He sat bolt upright, his massive frame radiating a sudden, intense energy that made the guards beside him shift uneasily. He ignored Genevieve's mist-killing blow, ignored the gasping crowd. That was the effect. He was searching for the cause. His gaze, sharp enough to cut stone, swept the courtyard. He scanned the nobles in their fine silks, their faces a mixture of shock and bloodlust. It wasn't them. The power he'd felt had no ego, no pride. He scanned the ranks of his own royal guard, their alpha auras blazing like small suns. Not them, either. Their power was a battering ram. This had been a surgeon's scalpel. Frustrated, his eyes moved to the peripheries, to the servants and workers who were the castle's invisible architecture. He swept past them, a baker's boy, a stable hand, a line of maids. And then his gaze locked. On an upper gallery, a scullery maid was frozen in place, her face pale as bone, clutching a brush like it was the only thing holding her upright. A wolfless omega, a nobody, a ghost. But her eyes were wide with a terror that was entirely out of place, a terror that went beyond merely witnessing a brutal duel. For a fraction of a heartbeat their eyes met across the courtyard. He saw her soul-deep panic, and she saw his dawning, thunderous suspicion. In that moment, though he could not fathom how, he knew. The impossible ripple had come from her. The girl who wasn't there, the girl no one ever saw, was suddenly the only person in the entire kingdom he could see at all. Chapter 6. The Scent of Starlight. That night, the moon was a flawless silver coin in a sky of black velvet. Oriana sought the only solace she had ever known within the fortress walls. The moon-viewing garden. It was a small, hidden courtyard, centered around a still, dark pool that perfectly mirrored the heavens. The air here was clean, scented with night-blooming jasmine instead of grease and despair. She knelt by the water's edge, her reflection a wavering silhouette against a sea of stars. Here, she could almost feel whole. She could let the power within her hum in harmony with the lunar glow, easing the frantic terror that had gripped her since the duel. She had been so foolish, so reckless. An invisible thread of power was still a thread, and the king was no fool. All afternoon she had felt his gaze on her, a heavy, calculating weight, even when he was nowhere to be seen. A shadow fell over the reflection in the pool, eclipsing the moon. Oriana's blood went cold. She didn't need to turn to know who stood behind her. The sheer force of his presence was a physical thing, a crushing pressure that stole the air from her lungs. "You have a secret, little maid." King Theron's voice was a low growl that vibrated through the stones. He stepped around the pool, his massive form blocking out the starlight, plunging her into his personal darkness. "In my courtyard, I felt a power that has been dead for a generation. And then I looked up, and I saw you. Explain it." Oriana scrambled to her feet, instinctively backing away. I don't know what you mean, Your Majesty. I am just a servant." "Do not lie to me," he snarled, taking another step, his golden eyes burning into her. He was close now, close enough for her to see the hard lines etched around his mouth, and he could smell her. He tilted his head, a flicker of confusion crossing his harsh features. Beneath the scent of lye soap and scullery grime, there was something else. Something faint, yet intoxicating. It smelled of moonbeams and winter jasmine, of starlight on snow. It was a scent that inexplicably called to the deepest, most primal part of his soul, and it was coming from this terrified, wolfless girl. It made no sense. "Witchcraft?" he accused, his voice thick with suspicion. "Is that what this is?" He reached for her, his hand a predator's claw about to snatch its prey. Chapter 7. A light in the darkness. His accusation struck her like a physical blow. Witchcraft. The word was a death sentence. Her mind screamed, trapped. He was too close, his presence an overwhelming, suffocating force. Every instinct, every fiber of her being that had been screaming hide, stay small, be nothing, was now shrieking run. She dodged his grasp, spinning away with a desperate burst of speed she didn't know she possessed. Her only thought was escape. But there was nowhere to go. He blocked the only exit, a looming mountain of fury and suspicion. Panic, raw and absolute, tore through the carefully constructed dams of her control. The silver river of power she had held back for a lifetime finally broke free. It began as a shimmer in the air around her. The jasmine scent intensified, blooming into an ethereal perfume. A soft, silver light emanated from her skin, pulsing with her frantic heartbeat. Theron froze, his eyes widening in stunned disbelief as he watched the impossible happen. The light grew brighter, brighter, until it was a blinding, divine radiance that consumed her form. Her bones shifted, her body elongating, not with the brutal crack and pop of a Lycan change, but with a silent, fluid grace. Where the meek, trembling servant girl had stood, a new creature rose. She was a wolf, yes, but a wolf of myth and legend. Her form was sleek and powerful, larger than any Lycan, yet radiating an otherworldly elegance rather than brute force. Her pelt was not fur, but spun moonlight, a shimmering liquid silver that seemed to absorb and magnify the glow from the heavens. Her eyes were not the gold of a predator, but the pure, luminous silver of the full moon itself. The light subsided, leaving the argent kindred standing in the silent garden, bathed in the moon's gentle glow. She was breathtaking. A creature of celestial power, a living piece of the night sky. She met the king's gaze, not with fear, but with the wild, untamable spirit of her true self, a low, melodic growl rumbling in her chest. Theron stood utterly motionless, his hand still outstretched. The strategist, the warrior, the pragmatic king, all were silenced. He stared at the myth made flesh before him, the scent of starlight now an undeniable, soul-shaking torrent. He had come seeking a witch. He had found a goddess. Chapter 8. The Gilded Leash. For a long moment, the only sound in the garden was the soft rustle of jasmine leaves in the night air. Theron slowly lowered his hand, his mind racing, recalibrating the entire world as he knew it. The last argent kindred. Here, hiding as a scullery maid in his own fortress. The impossibility of it was staggering, but the proof was before him, her silver pelt shimmering with a power that made the air itself thrum. He saw the danger. He saw the secret she had died 1,000 times to keep. But more than that, the king in him saw the solution. "You are the answer," he said, his voice a low, awestruck rumble. "A queen whose power is not just in fang and claw, but in this light. You could heal the rifts, unite the packs. You could be a symbol they would all kneel to." The magnificent wolf took a hesitant step back, the melodic growl turning into a warning. But they would not see a symbol. Theron pressed on, his strategic mind now fully in command. They would see a threat. And your enemies? The Blighted Guard? Do you think they have forgotten what they did? If they learned you existed, they would not rest until they finished the job. Oriana shifted back, the silver light receding as her human form returned. She stood before him, clad in her servant's rags, but with the moonlight still clinging to her skin, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. He was right. "So this is my offer," he said, his voice hard as iron once more. "A bargain. I will create a new identity for you. Lady Oriana, from a distant, forgotten noble house. You will enter the Blood Crown trials. I will train you myself. You will win." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her once more. "You will win, and you will take your place beside me as my queen, protected by my name and my entire army. That is one choice." He let the words hang in the air. "The other is that I walk out of this garden and announce to the entire court that the last Argent kindred has been found hiding in my scullery. I will let you choose which fate you prefer." Her heart sank like a stone. A gilded cage or a public execution, a leash or a slaughter. There was no choice at all. "I accept," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Chapter 9. Lessons in Silk and Steel. The next morning, Anna the scullery maid vanished. In her place, Lady Oriana was born, whisked from her damp stone cell to a suite of rooms in the royal wing. The chambers were opulent, with silk sheets, a warm hearth, and windows that looked out over the snow-capped peaks instead of a grimy alley. But to Oriana, it felt colder and more confining than her cell ever had. Her transformation began with ladies-in-waiting who scrubbed her raw, dressed her in suffocating corsets and heavy velvet gowns, and attempted to tame her wild hair into intricate braids. She learned to walk without hunching, to speak without whispering, to meet the eyes of nobles without flinching. Each lesson felt like a betrayal of the girl who had survived so long by being invisible. But the true torment began in the sparring yard. King Theron was a relentless and unforgiving teacher. He stripped her of the fine gowns and put a wooden practice sword in her hand. "Your power is a last resort," he growled, circling her like a wolf. "To use it is to reveal yourself. You will learn to fight as they do. You will learn to win with steel and sweat." He showed her no mercy. He was faster, stronger, his every move brutally efficient. He swept her legs out from under her, sending her crashing to the dirt. He disarmed her, the wooden sword clattering away, and pressed the blunted tip of his own against her throat. "You are hesitant," he criticized, his voice a lash. "You fight like you are apologizing for taking up space. A queen does not apologize. She takes." "I am not a queen," she finally gasped, scrambling to her feet, her body aching and her temper frayed to a thread. "I am a survivor. I survived by being quiet, by being unseen. You want me to become everything I have spent my life hiding from." "Yes," he roared, his golden eyes blazing with an intensity that both terrified and captivated her. "I want you to become the weapon you were born to be. Stop hiding in the shadows, girl, and start fighting." He lunged again, and this time, fueled by rage and desperation, she didn't just block his attack, she met it, a spark of defiance finally igniting in her eyes as wood crashed hard against wood. Chapter 10. The Trial of the Hunt. The horn blasted across the frosty morning air, signaling the start of the first official trial. 20 competitors, including Oriana, stood at the edge of the sprawling royal forests. She was dressed in practical leather armor, a simple sword at her hip, and a bow slung over her shoulder. She looked the part of a noblewoman, but inside, she was the same terrified scullery maid. Theron's brutal training had given her aches and bruises, but little confidence. The rules were simple. Each contestant was to hunt and return with the pelt of a shadow cat, a vicious and notoriously elusive predator. They had until sundown. Sabotage was not explicitly forbidden. As the competitors scattered into the woods, Oriana felt the familiar urge to simply disappear, to find a deep thicket and wait for this to be over. but Theron's final words to her echoed in her mind. Survive, but do not hide. She forced herself to move, relying on the tracking skills she'd learned as a child, long before the massacre. The forest was ancient and dense, the trees so thick they blotted out the sun. She found tracks quickly, too quickly. They were clumsy, the branches snapped with carelessness. It was another competitor. A trap? She slowed her pace, her senses on high alert. Deeper in the woods, a scream tore through the silence, followed by the savage snarl of a beast. Oriana froze, her hand flying to the hilt of her sword. Peeking through a thicket of ferns, she saw one of the noblewomen cornered against a rock face by a massive, snarling bear. It wasn't a shadow cat, but it was just as deadly. The woman shrieked as the bear rose onto its hind legs, its claws flashing. There was no time to think. Instinct took over. Oriana notched an arrow, but she knew a simple shot wouldn't be enough. Closing her eyes for a split second, she channeled the smallest sliver of her power. Not a wave, but a single focused pinprick of light, into the arrowhead. She drew the bowstring taut and released. The arrow flew, not as a piece of wood and steel, but as a tiny, silent comet. It struck the bear in the shoulder, and on impact, the stored energy flared in a brilliant, disorienting flash of silver light. The bear roared in confusion and pain, momentarily blinded, giving the noblewoman just enough time to scramble away to safety. But as the light faded, Oriana saw something that made her blood run cold. From across the clearing, hidden in the shadows of an ancient oak, Duchess Genevieve was staring directly at her, not with gratitude, but with a sharp, calculating glint of suspicion in her cold eyes. Chapter 11. Eyes of the King. Theron watched the trial not from the throne, but from the quiet solitude of his strategy chamber, his eyes fixed on a large, silver scrying bowl. The water's surface showed him the frost-kissed canopy of the royal forests, and with a whispered command, it would follow whomever he chose. He had been tracking Genevieve, noting her efficient, brutal progress. She was a predictable instrument of violence. Then, he had shifted his focus to Oriana. He told himself it was to monitor his asset, to ensure his gambit was protected. It was a cold, pragmatic lie, and he knew it. He watched her move through the forest with a grace that betrayed her scullery-maid disguise. She was a creature of the wilds, her senses alive and alert. A flicker of something akin to pride warmed his chest, an unfamiliar and unwelcome sensation. When the bear attacked the other contestant, he saw Oriana's hesitation. He saw the internal war in her posture. Flee! The commander in him ordered the image in the bowl. Do not engage, do not expose yourself. But she didn't flee. He watched, his jaw tightening, as she notched the arrow. He saw the faint, almost imperceptible shimmer as she channeled her power into the arrowhead. A fool's risk, a reckless, emotional act that could have cost her everything. And yet, when the arrow flew true and exploded in that brilliant, disorienting flash of celestial light, he felt a savage thrill. Her power was magnificent, but his thrill was immediately smothered by a cold dread. He commanded the scrying bowl to shift its perspective, to show him the aftermath from another angle. And there it was, Duchess Genevieve, half hidden by a tree, her face not a mask of fear or confusion, but of sharp, predatory calculation. She had seen it. She may not have understood it, but she had seen a flash of the impossible, and Theron knew the Duchess better than anyone. She would not dismiss it. She would hunt it. She would dissect it until she held the truth in her hands like a bloody trophy. He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning under his weight. He had pushed Oriana into the arena, intending to control her, to wield her power as a weapon for his kingdom. But in that single, impulsive act of mercy, she had revealed a sliver of her soul. She had saved a life, and in doing so, had painted a target squarely on her own back. A cold, possessive fury washed over him. It was not a king's anger over a compromised plan. It was the primal territorial rage of a male whose mate had just been threatened. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him shaken and dangerously protective. Chapter 12. The Nameless Prodigy. Oriana returned to the fortress just before sundown, a heavy shadow cat pelt slung over her shoulder. She had tracked and dispatched it with a clean arrow, her mind still reeling from her encounter with the bear, and with Genevieve's piercing stare. She had expected to slip back into her new chambers unnoticed, but the moment she entered the castle's main hall, a hush fell. Dozens of eyes turned to her. The whispers followed, slithering through the air like smoke. She was no longer a ghost. She was a spectacle. "That's her," a noblewoman hissed to her companion, hiding her mouth behind a jeweled fan. "The one they call Lady Oriana." "No one's ever heard of her house," the other replied, his eyes raking over Oriana's worn leather armor with disdain. "She fought like a back-alley brawler, not a highborn. They say she's the king's secret pet." The words were like stones, and she flinched from each one. She was a prodigy with no past, a mystery that the bored, vicious court was desperate to unravel. She kept her head held high, just as Theron had drilled into her, and walked through the gauntlet of stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every glance felt like an accusation, every whisper a threat to the fragile identity that was her only shield. Meanwhile, in her own lavish suite, Duchess Genevieve was not whispering. She was interrogating. The noblewoman Oriana had saved, Lady Honora, trembled before her. "It was the strangest thing," Honora stammered. "The arrow. It flashed. Like a star had fallen." "Nonsense," Genevieve said coolly, though her eyes were sharp with interest. "You were terrified. Your mind was playing tricks on you." She dismissed the girl with a wave of her hand, but the word star echoed in her mind. Later, she dispatched her most trusted servant, a man as silent and sharp as a shadow. "Find out everything there is to know about the House of Oriana," she commanded. "Every ledger, every family tree, every forgotten treaty. I want to know where she came from." That night, the servant returned with a report that was far more interesting than any sordid family history. He had spent hours in the royal archives, poring over ancient texts. "My Duchess," he said, his voice a low rasp, "there is no record of any noble house by that name. It does not exist." Genevieve's lips curved into a slow, cruel smile. The nameless prodigy was not just a mystery. She was a lie, and the Duchess was determined to find out what kind of truth that lie was meant to hide. Chapter 13. A Touch in the Sparring Yard. Theron's anger had been simmering all day. Anger at Genevieve's suspicion, anger at Oriana's recklessness, and a deeper, more unsettling anger at the raw, protective instinct she had awakened in him. He unleashed it all in the sparring yard. He was not a teacher today. He was a storm. "Again!" he roared, his wooden sword crashing against hers with a force that sent a painful jolt up her arms. "You leave your flank exposed. Do you want to die?" Oriana stumbled back, gasping for breath, her muscles screaming in protest. Every lesson since the hunt had been like this, a brutal, relentless assault. "I am trying," she shot back, her own frustration boiling over. "Trying is not enough. Winning is enough," he bellowed, lunging again. This time, something in Oriana snapped. The fear, the pressure, the constant performance, it all coalesced into a single point of pure, defiant rage. She didn't just block his attack, she threw herself into it, turning his momentum against him with a move that was pure instinct. The maneuver surprised him. For a fraction of a second, his perfect form faltered. Seeing her opening, she pressed the attack, no longer a reluctant student, but a desperate survivor fighting for ground. Wood slammed against wood in a frantic, furious rhythm. The air crackled with the intensity of their clash. He was stronger, but she was faster, smaller, fueled by a lifetime of suppressed energy. He finally broke through her defense, knocking her sword from her hand. But instead of the drill ending with his sword at her throat, their bodies collided. He reached out to steady her, his bare hand closing around her forearm, his momentum carrying them both down into the dirt of the yard. The moment his skin touched hers, the world exploded. It was not a spark, it was a supernova. A blinding, white-hot current arced between them, a jolt of pure energy that slammed into their souls. For an instant, they were no longer in the sparring yard. They were in a place of starlight and shadow, of celestial fire and primal earth. He felt the pure, humming river of her power, the call of the moon, the deep, aching loneliness she carried. She felt the roaring furnace of his wolf, the crushing weight of his crown, the profound solitude of a king who had no equal. The mating bond, which had been a faint, confusing scent, crashed into place with the force of a tidal wave, a soul-deep recognition that left them both utterly shattered. They pulled apart as if burned, scrambling back, their chests heaving. The yard was silent. The commander and his weapon were gone. In their place were two breathless strangers who had just seen into each other's deepest truths, bound by a force far more powerful and dangerous than any royal decree. Chapter 14. The Trial of Shadows. The air at the edge of the whispering cursed forest was unnaturally still and cold. A pale, sickly mist clung to the ground, swallowing the gnarled roots of ancient, black-barked trees that seemed to lean in, listening. The second trial required the competitors to travel through the heart of the forest to a clearing on the other side and retrieve a silver banner. It was a test of nerve. The forest was infamous for its psychic pollen, a substance released by a rare, ghost-white moss that induced vivid, terrifying hallucinations, preying on the deepest fears of any who breathed it in. After the raw, chaotic energy of the mating bonds awakening in the sparring yard, Oriana had been avoiding Theron, and he, her. The silence between them was a screaming void, filled with unspoken, dangerous truths. Now, stepping into the oppressive gloom of the forest, felt like a grim reflection of her own tormented mind. She pulled a cloth over her nose and mouth as instructed, but she knew it was a meager defense. Within minutes, the world began to warp. The whispers started, seeming to ride the thin wisps of fog. At first they were indistinct, like the rustling of leaves, but they slowly coalesced into words, her name spoken in voices she hadn't heard in decades. Oriana. Run. They're coming. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hand gripping the hilt of her sword. It isn't real, she chanted inwardly, Theron's harsh training a lifeline in the sea of illusion. Focus on the mission. Focus on the path. She pushed deeper, the trees growing thicker, their branches clawing at her clothes like skeletal fingers. The forest floor was a soft carpet of moss and decay, muffling her footsteps. She saw another competitor, a broad-shouldered alpha from a southern pack, wildly swinging his axe at phantom shapes in the mist, his eyes wide with terror. Further on, another was curled in a ball at the base of a tree, weeping for his mother. The forest was claiming them, one by one. Oriana's own fears began to take shape. The scent of burning pine filled the air, acrid and suffocating. She could hear the snarls of wolves, the clash of steel, the screams of her kindred. She stumbled over a root, falling to her knees. When she looked up, she was no longer in the forest. She was in a moonlit clearing, surrounded by the silver bodies of the slaughtered Argent kindred. Her mother lay before her, her fur stained crimson, her lifeless eyes staring up at the sky. A figure stood over her, his armor black and adorned with the sigil of the blighted guard. He turned and his face was King Theron's, his golden eyes filled with cold, merciless triumph. I told you I'd expose you, he snarled, raising a blood-soaked sword. You should never have trusted a hunter. The illusion was perfect, a waking nightmare crafted from her deepest trauma and her most immediate fear. A scream built in her throat, raw and terrified. She knew, on some distant, logical level, that it wasn't real, But her heart didn't. Her body didn't. She was paralyzed, trapped in the worst moment of her life. And the phantom Theron was walking toward her, his sword poised for the kill. Chapter 15. Echoes of the Past. From his chamber, Theron watched the scrying bowl with a cold knot of dread in his gut. He saw the forest's illusions take hold, saw his hardened warriors reduced to weeping children. When he focused the image on Oriana, he watched her fight, her resilience a flickering candle against a tidal wave of darkness. But then he saw her fall, her body trembling, her eyes wide with a horror that was not feigned. The water in the scrying bowl shimmered, and for a moment he saw what she saw, the massacre, the bodies of her kin, and then his own face twisted into a mask of villainy. The sight hit him with the force of a battering ram. The forest wasn't just showing her random fears. It was showing her a reality where her deepest loyalties were a lie, where he was the monster she feared most. That alone was enough to make him want to tear the forest down. But then he saw the true threat. Hidden behind a thicket of thorns, not 20 paces from where Oriana was trapped in her waking nightmare, was Duchess Genevieve. She wasn't hallucinating. A small, intricately carved charm hung from her wrist, glowing with a faint, nullifying light, an artifact to ward off the forest's magic. In her hand, she held a long, thin crossbow, the bolt tipped with a black, viscous substance. Wolfsbane concentrate. Lethal. Genevieve was calmly taking aim at Oriana's exposed back, a triumphant, cruel smirk on her lips. She wasn't just sabotaging her rival, she was executing her. Theron didn't hesitate. All thought of rules, of politics, of the crown, evaporated. The king was gone, and only the mate remained. He shot to his feet, a guttural roar ripping from his chest as he stormed from the chamber. He moved through the fortress not as a king, but as a blur of pure, unrestrained power, his guards barely registering his passage before he was gone. In the forest, Genevieve's finger tightened on the trigger. Time seemed to slow. The phantom Theron in Oriana's vision raised his sword. The real Genevieve was about to release her bolt. Oriana was about to die, killed by a ghost from her past, and an enemy in her present. Suddenly, the world exploded. A massive, dark-furred shape crashed through the trees with the force of a thunderbolt. It was Theron, in his full Lycan form, a creature of breathtaking size and primal fury. He was not meant to be here. His presence was a cataclysmic breach of the trial's sacred rules. He slammed into Genevieve, sending her and the crossbow flying before she could release the bolt. The weapon clattered uselessly into the undergrowth. Theron barely gave her a glance, his entire focus on the trembling form on the ground. He shifted back to his human form in a swirl of feral energy, his chest heaving, his golden eyes blazing. He knelt beside Oriana, his hands hovering over her, his voice a raw, desperate command. "Oriana! It's not real! Fight it!" From her hiding spot, bruised but alive, Genevieve watched. She saw not a king enforcing a rule, but a man breaking every rule for a single woman. She saw the raw, possessive terror in his eyes. And in that moment, all her suspicions clicked into place with chilling certainty. This wasn't about a political alliance. It wasn't about a secret weapon. The king had found his fated mate. Chapter 16. The Price of Protection. The aftermath of the trial was a blur. Theron had personally escorted a trembling Oriana from the forest, his face a mask of thunderous fury that parted the crowds before them. He dismissed the castle healers with a snarl, leading her to his private study, a chamber of maps, leather and steel that smelled of his power. He poured 2 goblets of dark spiced wine, pressing one into her cold hands. She stared into the crimson liquid, her mind a maelstrom of phantom swords and real crossbows, of his monstrous illusion and his desperate, rule-shattering rescue. "You broke the rules," she finally whispered, her voice hoarse. Her whole body ached with a bone-deep exhaustion. "You cannot interfere. That was the law you yourself proclaimed." Genevieve was going to kill you, he countered, his voice a low, rumbling growl. He stood by the hearth, the firelight catching the hard planes of his face. She had a bolt tipped with wolfsbane. That was not sabotage. It was assassination. Am I supposed to stand by and watch my kingdom's only hope be murdered in a cursed forest? His words were pragmatic, the argument of a king protecting his asset. But his eyes told a different story. The cold, calculating gold was gone, replaced by a turbulent, molten fire that spoke of something far more personal, far more primal. Your kingdom's hope? Or your gambit? Your weapon? She challenged, her voice gaining strength. The terror was receding, replaced by a hot, simmering anger. You threw me into this. You forced me to fight, to pretend, to walk into a viper's nest with a target on my back. Your protection is the very reason I needed to be saved. She stood, slamming the goblet down on the table. You don't understand. For years my only protection was silence, invisibility. Now, everyone whispers my name. Genevieve looks at me and she doesn't see a rival. She sees a puzzle she is dying to solve. Your protection is a gilded cage, and the bars are drawing closer every single day. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, stopping just before her. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. The air between them crackled with the memory of the mating bond, a current of unspoken energy that was both terrifying and magnetic. I am protecting you, he ground out, his jaw tight. I will not let her touch you. Why? Oriana demanded, her chin tilted up in defiance, forcing herself to meet his blazing gaze. Why do you truly care if I live or die? The question hung between them, heavy and dangerous. He opened his mouth to give the strategic answer, to talk of unity and symbols. But the words wouldn't come. The truth was a wild beast clawing at his throat. He looked at her, at the defiant tilt of her chin, the lingering fear in her eyes, the sheer, impossible strength that held her together. Because, he said, his voice dropping to a raw, strained whisper that cost him everything. The thought of a world without you in it has become intolerable. He didn't touch her, but his admission was more intimate than any caress, a crack in his iron facade that left them both utterly exposed. Chapter 17. A Serpent's Clue. Duchess. Genevieve did not rage about her failed attempt. Rage was an indulgence for the weak. Instead, she sat in the silent, cold stone of her private library, her mind a razor-sharp instrument of analysis. She replayed the scene in the forest over and over. The girl's strange, star-like arrow, the king's impossible suicidal intervention, and his eyes. The raw, possessive fury in his eyes had not been for an asset. It was for a treasure. The king had found his fated mate. The realization didn't infuriate her, it invigorated her. A political marriage could be undermined. A fated bond had to be shattered. Her servant's report that the House of Oriana did not exist was the first key. The girl was a fraud. The king had fabricated her identity. The question was, what truth was he so desperate to hide? The answer, she suspected, lay with the arrow. Like a star had fallen. The phrase echoed in her mind. It was poetic, fanciful, but it sparked a distant memory of a text she had once dismissed as folklore. She moved to a locked, iron-bound chest in the corner of the room. From it, she retrieved a set of ancient, crumbling scrolls, texts forbidden by the king's own grandfather for containing dangerous and heretical lore. She unrolled the first one carefully, the brittle parchment crackling in protest. It was a bestiary of magical creatures, most of them long extinct. She scanned the pages, her finger tracing the faded ink, passing over descriptions of chimeras and basilisks until she found it. It was a small passage, accompanied by a faded illustration of a magnificent wolf whose pelt was drawn not with ink, but with a silver, shimmering pigment. The text called them the Argent Kindred. It described them as a bloodline that did not draw power from rage or instinct, but channeled the pure, raw energy of the moon itself. It spoke of their transformations as events of celestial light and their abilities as being of protection and healing. And it mentioned their one critical weakness. Their power, being of pure light, was anathema to shadow magic. A focused burst of corrupting shadow energy would not kill one of them outright. It would poison their connection to the moon, causing their control to shatter and forcing a painful, monstrous transformation that would expose their true nature to the world. Genevieve's breath hitched. She read on, her heart beginning to hammer with a cold, triumphant beat. The scroll then described a specific artifact favored by the Argent Kindred's greatest enemies, the Blighted Guard. It was a small obsidian shard, which, when activated with a drop of the wielder's blood, would unleash just such a burst of targeted, corrupting shadow. A weapon designed not just to harm, but to expose. To twist something divine into something that would look, to the ignorant masses, like a creature of pure evil. She let the scroll roll shut, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. The puzzle was solved. The mysterious Lady Oriana was a relic, a myth, a creature of light hiding in a kingdom of wolves. And Genevieve now possessed the one key that could drag her out of the shadows and into the fire. She would not just kill her rival in the final duel, she would unmask her as a monster in front of the entire kingdom. Chapter 18. A Promise in the Dark. The night before the final trial was heavy with an almost unbearable tension. The entire fortress seemed to be holding its breath. For Oriana, the oppressive silence of her chambers was worse than any noise. She couldn't sit still, her mind a frantic battlefield of fight strategies and Genevieve's cold, calculating eyes. She fled, seeking the one place that felt like hers, the moon-viewing garden. The moon was a sliver of silver tonight, a scythe hanging in the dark, and its reflection in the still pool was faint and fragile. It felt like a grim omen. She heard his footsteps on the stone path, heavier and more deliberate than the night he had first cornered her here. She didn't turn. She already knew the overwhelming weight of his presence. Theron stopped beside her at the water's edge, not as a king or a commander, but as a man burdened by the weight of the world. For a long time, they just stood in silence, watching the thin sliver of moon. "I was a fool to force this upon you," he said finally, his voice a low rumble that was startlingly devoid of its usual command. "I saw a solution to my kingdom's problems. A symbol. I did not properly see the woman I was sacrificing to get it." His admission was so unexpected it stole her breath. She turned to look at him, truly look at him. In the dim light, the harsh lines of his face seemed softer, the iron will in his eyes tempered by a deep, weary concern. "I was a servant in the scullery," she said softly. "My life was a slow death. You may have thrown me to the wolves, but at least now, I am fighting. I am not just hiding." "You fight with honor, Oriana," he said, his gaze intense. "I have watched you. You could have maimed your opponents in the arena today. You chose not to. You showed mercy. It is a language this court has forgotten." He took a half-step closer, the space between them shrinking, becoming charged with a fragile, profound intimacy. "I have faith in you. Not in the Argent Kindred. Not in my future queen. In you. The woman who saved a girl in the courtyard because it was the right thing to do. The woman who faced down a bear for a stranger." Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and unfamiliar. No one had ever spoken of faith in her, not in her entire lonely life. "I am afraid," she confessed, the whisper of a truth she hadn't even admitted to herself. He didn't offer false comfort or a commander's platitudes. He simply nodded, his expression softening with a raw vulnerability that mirrored her own. "I know," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "So am I." His gaze held hers, a silent promise passing between them in the dark. It was not a promise of victory, but of witness. A promise that no matter what happened tomorrow when she stepped onto the arena sand, she would not be alone. It was more than she'd ever had, and it was everything she needed. Chapter 19. The Arena of Duels. Dawn broke, cold and gray, over the gray bastion. The sound that woke Oriana was not a gentle bird call, but the dull, hungry roar of a crowd gathering in the grand arena. The final trial had begun. The day was structured as a tournament, a brutal ladder of single combat where the winners advanced and the losers were carried from the field. Dressed in hardened black leather armor, a gift from Theron, Oriana felt a strange, cold calm settle over her. The fear was still there, a knot of ice in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a sharp, clear sense of purpose. She stepped onto the blood-stained sand of the arena to a murmur of speculation. She was the dark horse, the nameless prodigy. Her first opponent was a hulking alpha from the northern packs, a man who grinned, showing stained teeth, clearly expecting an easy victory. He charged her with a roar, his heavy axe swinging in a deadly arc meant to cleave her in two. But Theron had not trained her to be a brawler, he had trained her to be a blade. Instead of meeting his force with her own, she flowed around it, just as he had taught her. She used his own momentum against him, sidestepping the clumsy swing and delivering a sharp, precise blow with the pommel of her sword to the back of his knee. He bellowed in pain and surprise, stumbling. She didn't press the attack to kill. She moved in, her sword a blur, and disarmed him with a sharp twist, his axe flying from his grasp. With his weapon gone and his leg buckling, he yielded, his face a mask of humiliated disbelief. The crowd, which had been cheering for the brute, went quiet for a beat, then erupted in a roar of genuine appreciation. They had expected a brawl. They had witnessed artistry. Her second duel was against a swift, agile woman who wielded twin daggers. It was a dance of death, blades flashing in the cold sunlight. Oriana remembered Theron's relentless drills, the endless repetition of parry, block, and riposte. She took a shallow cut on her arm, the pain a sharp, clarifying sting. But she saw the opening, the flicker of overconfidence in her opponent's eyes, and she exploited it. A feint to the left, a quick spin, and she had the woman trapped, the tip of her own sword pressed gently against her opponent's throat. Another yield, more respect from the stands. She fought with a clean efficiency, never wasting a movement, never succumbing to bloodlust. She was strong, yes. But more than that, she was smart. She was honorable. With each victory, the whispers about the king's pet grew quieter, replaced by cheers for the mysterious warrior who fought with the soul of a queen. From his throne, Theron watched. His hands clenched so tightly on the iron arms that his knuckles were white, his pride a blazing inferno in his chest. Finally, after a long and grueling day, the royal herald stepped onto the sand, his voice magically amplified to fill the stadium. The final contest for the Blood Crown is at hand, a duel to the death. The challenger, Duchess Genevieve, against the victor of the day, Lady Oriana. A deafening roar shook the very foundations of the arena, as the two women walked from opposite ends, their eyes locking across the blood-soaked sand. Chapter 20. A Duel to the Death. The roar of the crowd faded into a dull hum in Oriana's ears. All that existed was the circular expanse of the arena floor and the woman walking toward her. Duchess Genevieve was the embodiment of lethal perfection. Her armor was enameled black steel, intricately etched with silver. Her sword was a masterpiece of sharpened steel, and she held it with an easy, familiar grace. But it was her eyes that held the real danger. They were chips of ice, filled with a cold, unshakable certainty of her own victory. There was no rage there, no passion, only the chillingly calm focus of an executioner. Oriana walked to the center of the arena, her heart a steady, heavy drum against her ribs. This was it. The culmination of the king's bargain, of her brutal training, of a life spent in hiding. She could feel Theron's gaze on her like a physical weight, a silent, desperate prayer from his throne. She met Genevieve's eyes and saw the flicker of contempt, the dismissal of her as an upstart, a fraud. Let her think that, Oriana thought. Let her underestimate me. They stopped 10 paces from each other. The royal herald raised a hand. "The rules are simple," he boomed. "There are none. The duel ends only with submission or death. Let the final trial commence." With a final, deafening blast from the ceremonial horn, the duel began. They didn't charge. They circled, 2 predators sizing each other up, the sand crunching softly under their boots. Genevieve moved with a languid, serpentine grace, her sword weaving in slow, hypnotic patterns. It was a test of nerve, a psychological assault before the first blow was even struck. Oriana stood her ground, her stance balanced, her sword held ready in a simple, effective guard Theron had drilled into her for hours. She breathed slowly, calming her frantic pulse, focusing on the here and now. The whispers of the forest were gone, replaced by the sharp clarity of impending combat. Genevieve's lips curved into that cruel, familiar smile. "You are a fine pretender, little maid," she purred, her voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "But the charade ends today. The king cannot save you now." With a sudden explosion of movement that was far faster than her circling had suggested, Genevieve lunged. It wasn't a simple thrust, but a complex series of feints designed to confuse and overwhelm. Steel rang against steel with a piercing shriek as Oriana met the first blow. The force was staggering, far greater than she had anticipated. Genevieve was phenomenally strong. Oriana was thrown back a step, her arm vibrating from the impact. The fight was on. The dance of death had begun, and before the sun set, the entire kingdom would finally know the truth of the girl who wasn't there. Chapter 21. A Serpent's Gambit. Genevieve pressed her attack with relentless ferocity. Her sword was a blur, a silver serpent striking from every angle. She was not just strong, she was ruthless, aiming for vulnerable points, using every dirty trick in the book. Oriana parried, blocked, and dodged, her every muscle burning. Theron's training had made her capable, but Genevieve fought with a primal, desperate hunger that bordered on madness. Oriana took a glancing blow to her shoulder, the impact jarring her to the bone. She stumbled, losing ground, and a wave of raw fear washed over her. Genevieve's eyes gleamed with triumph. "You're fading, Oriana," Genevieve snarled, pushing her back, her voice laced with venom. "This borrowed strength is not your own. You are a servant in borrowed silks. A fraud." Oriana knew she couldn't win this with pure force. Genevieve was too seasoned, too brutal. But Theron had also taught her to anticipate, to read her opponent. She saw the familiar flicker of arrogance in Genevieve's eyes, the almost imperceptible pause, the subtle shift in weight that spoke of a prepared move, a final, decisive strike. Genevieve was not just trying to kill her, she was trying to prove a point. She was trying to break her spirit. Suddenly, Genevieve disengaged, leaping back a few paces. A gasp went through the crowd. This was not a retreat. It was a setup. With a theatrical flourish, she reached into her armor and produced a small obsidian shard. It was smooth, dark, and pulsed with a faint, malevolent energy that made Oriana's power recoil instinctively. Genevieve cut her own palm with a sharp nail, squeezing a drop of blood onto the artifact. It flared with a sickening black light, and a wave of corrupting shadow magic surged toward Oriana like a venomous tide. "This is for the pretenders!" Genevieve screamed, her face contorted in a mask of triumph. "This will show them what you truly are, a creature of darkness, fit only for the grave." The shadow energy hit Oriana with the force of a physical blow, a chilling, invasive darkness that sought to twist and corrupt the pure moon magic within her. Pain lanced through her, white-hot and excruciating. Her control, already strained, buckled under the assault. She heard the crowd gasp, then murmur in confusion, then outright fear. This was Genevieve's plan: to forcibly expose her, but to make her transformation monstrous, terrifying, to turn the kingdom against her. Oriana fell to her knees, clutching her chest, her body convulsing. The dark magic screamed through her veins, fighting against the celestial light, threatening to tear her apart. Her vision blurred, her ears filled with a roaring static. She was losing control. The world swam. She felt her body begin to shift, not with the fluid grace of her true form, but with a horrifying, agonizing wrenching of bone and muscle. Genevieve laughed, a wild, triumphant shriek. "See, King? See the demon you would put on your throne." Chapter 22. The Dawn of the Argent. The shadow artifact's magic was a brutal, searing fire, twisting Oriana's very essence, but in the midst of the pain, a deeper instinct, honed by generations of pure lunar magic, roared to life. This darkness was meant to corrupt, to twist, to make her monstrous. But the Argent kindred were not of darkness. They were of light. The shadow magic, instead of corrupting, acted as a violent catalyst, a forced purification. It tried to break her, but it only shattered the last vestiges of her human reluctance, burning away the fear and the hidden self. With a defiant, guttural cry that was more wolf than human, Oriana threw back her head. A blinding explosion of silver light erupted from her, washing over the arena. It was not the sinister glow Genevieve had anticipated, but a divine, celestial radiance that pushed back the invading shadows, cleansed the air, and illuminated every corner of the vast stadium. The wrenching, agonizing transformation smoothed into a breathtaking, powerful shift. Where the kneeling, struggling woman had been, a magnificent wolf now stood. Her size was awe-inspiring, easily twice that of a normal Lycan, yet she radiated not brute force, but an ethereal, potent majesty. Her pelt was pure, liquid moonlight, flowing like spun silver. Her eyes, no longer afraid, blazed with the intense, pure light of a full moon, utterly uncorrupted, utterly divine. She let out a single piercing howl that echoed through the arena, a song of sorrow and power, a declaration of her true self. The shadow magic, rejected and overwhelmed, dissipated into thin wisps of smoke. Genevieve stood frozen, her jaw slack, her triumph replaced by utter horror. This wasn't the demon she had promised. This was a goddess. The Argent kindred, a myth, a legend, a being of pure celestial power. The silver wolf turned her gaze upon Genevieve, and in those luminous eyes, there was no rage, no desire for revenge. Only a vast, ancient wisdom. Oriana stalked forward, her paws silent on the sand, every movement radiating an overwhelming, effortless power. Genevieve, still in shock, finally snarled, raising her sword for a desperate final attack. But Oriana moved with a speed that defied comprehension. She didn't bite, she didn't claw. With a single elegant sweep of her massive silver paw, she disarmed the Duchess. Genevieve's sword flew from her hand, spinning end over end before landing with a dull thud in the sand, far out of reach. Genevieve stumbled back, defenseless, a pathetic figure before the sheer, unadulterated power of the Argent Queen. Oriana stood over her, her massive head lowered, her silver muzzle just inches from Genevieve's trembling face. The Duchess looked into those blazing, lunar eyes, and for the first time in her life, she saw true power, untainted by malice, but utterly absolute. She cowered, expecting the killing blow, expecting the rending of flesh. But it didn't come. Chapter 23. A mercy long forgotten. The arena was utterly silent. No one moved, no one breathed. All eyes were fixed on the tableau. The magnificent silver wolf, the myth made flesh, standing over the cowering, defeated Duchess Genevieve. The air thrummed with the aftermath of the transformation, with the raw, pure power that Oriana now commanded. The crowd had expected a monster, a horrifying display of dark magic. They had witnessed a miracle. Oriana shifted back, the celestial light receding, her human form returning with fluid grace. She still radiated power, her eyes holding that luminous silver glow, her skin shimmering faintly. She stood over Genevieve, not with contempt, but with an almost profound sadness. "This is not how we heal our kingdom," she said, her voice clear and strong, resonating through the hushed arena. "Not with more death, not with more hatred." With a deliberate, unhurried movement, she knelt beside the fallen Duchess. She did not raise a weapon. Instead, she extended her hand, not to help her up, but to touch the ground beside Genevieve's discarded sword. With a whisper of pure lunar energy, she caused the blade to shatter into 1,000 glittering fragments of steel, rendering it useless. It was a clear message. Her power was not for death, but for peace. Then she stood and turned to face the stunned court, her gaze sweeping over the thousands of faces, from the lowest peasant to the highest noble. "We have been blinded by old wounds, by ancient hatreds," she proclaimed, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "We have forgotten what it means to lead with heart, not just with claw. The time for shedding more blood to claim a crown is over." A profound silence held the arena for a moment, and then a single voice cried out, "All hail the Argent Queen." It was a young Omega from the lower tiers, then another and another. The cry swelled, growing from a ripple to a wave, until the entire arena erupted in a deafening roar of approval. It was not just applause for a victor, it was adoration for a leader, for a beacon of hope they hadn't known they desperately needed. They had witnessed not just a triumph in combat, but a triumph of mercy, a mercy long forgotten in their brutal world. From his throne, King Theron descended, his face no longer cold and pragmatic, but alight with an emotion that was breathtaking to behold. Profound pride, overwhelming love, and a joy so deep it threatened to unmake him. He walked directly to Oriana, oblivious to the thousands of eyes on him, oblivious to everything but her. He took her hand, his calloused fingers closing around hers. He raised their joined hands high, his golden eyes blazing with a fierce, possessive love that proclaimed to all, "She is my mate, she is my queen." The arena erupted once more, a roar of unified triumph and acceptance. The king had found his queen, and the kingdom had found its dawn. Chapter 24: The King and His Queen. Days later, the celebrations had finally subsided, leaving a fragile peace in their wake. Oriana stood with Theron on the battlements of the Grey Bastion, the biting mountain wind whipping her hair around her face. She wore a simple, elegant gown of silver gray, and on her head rested not a crown of iron, but a delicate circlet of woven silver, a testament to her unique power. The kingdom stretched out before them, a vast tapestry of snow-capped peaks and winding valleys, bathed in the soft, ethereal glow of the rising moon. She was no longer the invisible servant, nor the king's reluctant weapon. She was queen. And Theron, standing beside her, no longer bore the crushing weight of singular leadership. His hand rested lightly on the small of her back, a silent testament to their bond, to the undeniable force that had forged them together. "There will be challenges," he said, his voice a low rumble, breaking the comfortable silence. "Genevieve's allies will test us. The blighted guard may yet seek you out." Oriana leaned her head against his shoulder, finding an unexpected comfort in his solid presence. "Then we will face them. Together." She looked out at the moonlit land, at the scattered lights of distant villages that housed his people, now her people. "You have strength, Theron, an unyielding will. But you had forgotten mercy, compassion, the light within." He turned his head, his golden eyes meeting her silver ones, a warmth blooming between them that banished the mountain chill. And you, Oriana, had forgotten your power, your voice, the strength of your own heart. You had forgotten how to fight for more than just survival. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. We are whole now, together. She smiled, a genuine, joyful curve of her lips that transformed her face, radiating a serenity that hadn't existed in her before. The deep, aching loneliness that had been her constant companion for so long had finally been banished. She had found a purpose, a home, and a love that had seen past her disguise, past her fear, and embraced the radiant truth of who she was. Below them, the fortress glowed under the moon's watchful eye. The fractured kingdom, scarred by old wounds and ancient hatreds, had found its unexpected healing. He, the king of iron and strategy, and she, the queen of moonlight and mercy, stood united. The gray bastion, once a symbol of cold, imposing power, now held the promise of a new dawn, a future where strength was balanced by wisdom and fear was overcome by hope. Their journey had begun in shadows, but it would lead their people into the light.